Guitar tips, guitar tips, just the tips, just for you, guitar tips. Hello, and welcome to Guitar Tips. My name is Adam Levy. This is my weekly video blog series here on my YouTube channel. I post a new tip here each and every Friday, and I hope that you will check them out. I hope that you will become a subscriber. It's very easy to do. There's a red button down there below. It says subscribe. Just click on it and you're in, and I appreciate it. Guitar Tips is brought to you by the Martin Guitar String Company. I dig Martin guitar strings. I use them on all of my steel string guitars. I like the Retro series, and I use a light gauge. And I like them because they sound good, they stay in tune, they feel good under my fingers, and they last a good long time. That's really all I can ask of in a string, and Martin guitar strings do all of that and more, I would say. Good string, good people. Check them out. I think I said this, the Retro set. So check those out. They're a little bit different, though. The winding on the wound strings is some kind of nickel alloy, so it's a little mellower than your typical bronze or brass string winding. This guitar, as you may notice, is not a steel string guitar. It's my trusty old Guild nylon, and I'll be honest, I'm not sure what strings are on here. I change these about once a year, and then I tune it about once a year too. It's an old friend, this guitar. Anyway, on with the tips. So this week's tip is a pretty, well, I'll just say what it is. Doesn't need me to talk about it yet. This week's guitar tip is: don't confuse scales with music. That's right, don't confuse scales with music. Now, I should say this tip was inspired by a question I got from a viewer. His name is James, but his email handle, I love it. It's Melodious Bard. Melodious Bard. That's a great handle, James. James wrote in, and you can write in too if you have a question. My email address here is guitartips@adamlevy.com. Anyway, James says, Hi. I know the diatonic scale in all positions. However, when I play within them, unless I'm playing over a band or a backing track, I cannot seem to make them sound musical. Do you have any advice in relation? That's a really good question. Many students that I've worked with over the years have had similar concerns. I practice my scales, I know them all over the place, and then I'm not sure how to make music out of the scales. And if you're feeling that way, don't feel like you're doing anything wrong, okay? That is a kind of backwards way of approaching music. I think it's a lot to ask of the scales and of yourself, really, to work on these exercises. You know, scales are important, of course. There's a lot of technical stuff that we can get at on the guitar, just as far as our left hand, assuming that you're a right-handed player, but your fretting hand, and also how your fretting hand and your picking hand line up. Just getting from one note to the next in a graceful way, and being able to do that consistently. Scales are great material to work on for that on the guitar. But they're really not the place to turn to when you want to make music. You know, I think about Miles Davis. I don't know if you guys are that into jazz, but if you're into jazz, you'll probably be aware of Miles Davis, who was a trumpet player. And you may be aware of a famous record of his from, I think, 1959 called Kind of Blue. Kind of Blue. And it's, you know, people talk about this as an important record in jazz because it's a shift towards modal improvisation. Before that record, a lot of the jazz that you would hear would be based on popular tunes of the day, you know, just popular tunes from the 40s and 50s. And with Kind of Blue, Miles wrote a new kind of music that had these extended vamps where the chords didn't really move around that much. So you'd have, say, 8 bars of D minor 7 or even 16 bars of D minor 7. And that was considered modal music because the harmony wasn't moving around so much. And so a lot of the improvisation was done using modal. Modes are just another name for scales, okay? There's a particular set of scales that we call the modes. I've touched on that earlier in two recent tips called Dorian is Dorian, so you can check those out if you're curious. But anyway, the thing about Miles and Kind of Blue and the modes is there's 2 things that I think are important. One is he doesn't really stay exactly in the modes. He does use some other notes, as do all of the other players on the record. When you listen to Cannonball Adderley or John Coltrane or Bill Evans, none of them is sticking strictly to the modes. So that's one thing to keep in mind, is that it's not it's not strictly modal. And then the other thing is that Miles Davis and all of the aforementioned guys, before 1959, before making this shift to a new sound with modes, had played lots of jazz music before. Lots and lots and lots of jazz music. They knew popular tunes of the day. They knew things that were written by, you know, fellow jazz musicians. And they had lots of experience playing jazz melodies. So when they decided to make this shift to modal improvisation, they weren't improvising, you know, for the first time. They were experienced improvisers, and they also were very familiar with jazz repertoire. So they knew how melodies worked, having played lots of them over many, many, many years. So James, if you're still watching and listening, I'll get around to hopefully to your question more directly. But I feel like that needs saying, that sometimes people say, oh well, you know, Kind of Blue is a modal record, and you know, Miles played these kind of impressionistic little, you know, almost melodic fragments within the modes, and that's true, and you could do that from wherever you are as a musician. But don't forget that he had already played tons of jazz music and knew the way that music works. Same with the Beatles. You know, by the time the Beatles started writing their original music, they had already learned and performed covers for you know, a while. They had a pretty good idea of what songs were made of, you know, melodically, harmonically, lyrically. They didn't just come out of the gate writing these perfect songs. You know, they got to know some other songs. So I guess that what I'm trying to say is, if you're practicing scales and then wondering how to convert them into musical stuff, I would say that maybe that's not the way that you want to approach it. I would encourage you to learn licks. Like if you're listening to Miles Davis's Kind of Blue and you hear him play a lick that intrigues you, check it out, see what it is. It's probably going to be modal. It might have some other notes in it. And make that part of your vocabulary. Develop a vocabulary of licks and phrases. and just tunes. Learn tunes in whatever style you're interested in. It doesn't have to be jazz. It could be whatever kind of music you like. Learn the when I say learn songs, I don't just mean learn to play the chords behind the songs. Actually play the melodies. I have one student who's been trying to figure out a bunch of U2 songs, just the melodies. He's learning the vocal melodies on the guitar, and I think that's a great way to see what music is really made of, what melodies are made of. And I think once you get to know what melodies are made of, then your improvisation will have a more melodic strength to it. You won't just be running up and down the scales. I also was thinking about this John Scofield interview that I read in Guitar Player in 2011. He had a new record out at that time, which was called 54, where he played with an orchestra. And the interviewer was asking him questions about, what scales you're playing and what modes you're playing. And Scofield got a little bit, I'm just going to read you part of this interview, and you'll see. So the interviewer, a guy named Jimmy Leslie, asks Scofield, he says, "It seems that the first track, Carlos, is basically a D minor vamp, and that you're mainly soloing in the Dorian mode until the turnaround changes come, at which point your runs become more involved. Can you explain what's going on at that point?" And then Scofield says, well, you've got to play through the chord changes, but I don't think distinctly in Dorian during the vamp, because there are notes in between. The Dorian mode is really just a scale. There's more to what I play, but I can't really talk about it because you've got to hear that stuff. And then the next question has to do with a song called Polo Towers, and Scofield describes this chord that he plays where he tunes the low E down to C sharp. And he plays this chord, which is, he calls C sharp 7, 13, sharp 9. So that's C sharp, E sharp. Yes, there is an E sharp. A sharp, that's the 13. B is the flat 7, so that makes it a dominant chord with the 13. And then E, or D double sharp, is the sharp 9. So these two strings are open, these two strings are 3rd fret, and then we've got a low C sharp. Pretty neat chord. Anyway, the interviewer asks him, he says, that's a cool chord. Can you explain what you play during the chromatic sounding head melody that follows? And Scofield says, there's nothing to explain. You just need to check out the notes, and they are what they are. And then the interviewer says, I know it's difficult, but can you take a shot at describing some of the fantastic moves you make, whether they are pieces of chords or chromatic notes that take your playing beyond the box, but not too far out? And Scofield says, I won't describe them. I'm not going to oversimplify what has been my life's work, which is to develop a vocabulary in jazz. You learn licks, phrases, and songs, and then you try to piece together what you've learned tastefully so that you don't sound like you are regurgitating licks. You listen to what's going on for inspiration, and if you trust your own mind and instinct, then you'll come up with another idea. On 54, the album is called 54. On 54, I found it easy to have something to say because there was a lot of input from the orchestra. Eventually, you realize that you've said enough, and then it's time to shut up and end your solo. Yeah, so, and then there's just one more little bit from this that I wanted to read. A little later in this interview, Scofield says, I hope I didn't come across as rude when I was waxing on about how you can't explain licks and stuff like that. It's just a pet peeve of mine. I realize that's part of what the magazine does, but for me it's a little too close to jazz guitar in 10 easy steps. I won't dumb it down because I think smart people are going to get into it for what it is, and they want to know the real deal. Jazz takes strong desire, and it requires a lot of practice. Once it's ingrained, it's like a magic trick done with mirrors. You become fluent in a certain way that's even greater than your own understanding of how you got there. People think fluency in jazz is a big intellectual thing, but it's actually just a lot of work. You have to do the time. And I think that's just really beautiful, well put. Thank you, John Schofield. And thank you, Guitar Player Magazine, for publishing this. It's just a really candid slice of conversation. And yeah, so if you've already put in the time on the scales, that's great. That's time well spent. But when it comes time to making music, you need to practice making music. I'll use scales in two ways that I just wanted to mention that you might want to try with scales. But I agree with John 100% that practicing scales is really not enough. You need to learn licks and phrases and songs, repertoire, whatever the music you're interested in. Get into the music of it and then think about improvising. All of the early improvisers in jazz were coming at it from the melody first and just stretching the melody until it became something original. So I was just going to say that the two ways that I actually find scales to be valuable in my practice time, besides the obvious technical stuff that I spoke of, is just knowing how to expand chords. Let's say just humor me, pretend it's in tune. So if I'm playing now, let's say C sharp minor, and I think about Dorian. Dorian is just really a collection of notes. And if I've got a C sharp minor triad and I just want to make it more colorful, instead of going at it, all the chromatic notes, I might just limit myself to looking at the Dorian notes and go for one of those to make the chord a little more colorful. So I might add the 9, or I might add the 11. That's F sharp here. Or I might add 13. That's A sharp up here. I don't know if you're familiar with Alan Holdsworth, but a friend of mine said he got to see him do some kind of clinic or master class somewhere, and he was talking about how he sees the scales all over the neck, and when he wants to invent some new chord voicings or discover some new chord voicings, he can just sort of grab at a group of notes from the scale. He's not thinking about traditional chord voicing in the way that harmony, traditionally is stacked up. He's just grabbing a handful of notes from the scale, and that's kind of interesting. And that's sort of what I'm talking about here. If I'm improvising harmonically and I know this is a C sharp minor triad, I might just look for stuff that's nearby to color my chord. Right? I'm just kind of grabbing at stuff that's within reach without, getting into this kind of stuff. So that's one way that I find scales useful, is actually in building harmonic structures and knowing what you can use. The other way that scales can be helpful in practice that I find helpful is just sequencing, playing an idea and then seeing how that could go up the neck. And there's something to sequencing that has to do with making melodies, but on the whole, don't confuse scales with music. Practice your scales. It's just like, eating your oatmeal or whatever. Needs to be done. But then get into practicing music and learning music. On a related note, you might find two other tips helpful. Tip number 62, practice real music. And tip number 76, music is not math. Okay, James, I hope this was helpful. And I hope it was helpful to you, even if your name is not James. Don't confuse scales with music. This is Guitar Tips. My name is Adam Levy. Oh, this is new. Just got these in yesterday. Kind of excited. Guitar Tips, guitar picks. I dropped it. It's okay, I've got 799 more of them. Thanks to the Dunlop Manufacturing Company for those. And thanks for tuning in. My name is Adam Levy. Stay tuned and take good care.